For the second time in 7 days, we're meeting again to furiously consider 13 bills, maybe 14 bills, only 3 of which have been scored by the CBO. In some committees, like the Help Committee, which I'm also on, we don't bring any bills. Nothing's brought forward that's not scored by the CBO. So there are different standards in different committees, but it is true that in some committees we don't bring forward bills at all that are not scored. I wish this markup was an exception to the norm, but astonishingly, it's all too frequent that my colleagues in Congress blindly vote on bills without any regard to the nation's dire fiscal circumstances. It doesn't take much imagination to understand how we've arrived at a $32 trillion debt. That's 136% of GDP. This is a staggering burden that will worsen if Congress continues to avoid action. Most of the bills under consideration today are proposing additional funds to the Department of Homeland Security. If you look at the chart, this will be the first chart, you can sort of see what has happened with Department of Homeland Security spending. Started out right after 9/11 and started at $30 billion. It quickly doubled over the first decade and now has tripled. So we're now over $100 billion in spending. We've really never had a meeting to discuss the $100 billion, to discuss whether we're spending too much in some places and too little in other places. We've never really had any hearings to discuss what's working and what's not working. DHS serves as an excellent case study of Congress's blatant disregard for fiscal responsibility. From a budget of $31 billion, we've now grown to over $100 billion. For perspective, this is more than twice as quick as our nation's economy grew the same period. It now takes the entire tax revenue of more than 37 states to fully fund the $103 billion of the Department of Homeland Security. This begs a question that this committee unfortunately does not seem keen on answering. Where is this money going? Some will argue that DHS's growth is justified given the crisis we now have at the border. What we do need, and do indeed have a crisis at the border, doesn't seem to be the focus of DHS. In the last 5 years, DHS's overall expenditures have grown 58%, despite the situation at the border progressively getting worse. The growth for border activities, that is, funds spent on Customs and Border Patrol, TSA, ICE, and Coast Guard, have grown around 24%. So the overall DHS is growing at 58%, and money allocated towards the border is growing at 24%. And you can see this where the growth has been. Office of the Secretary and Executive Management, the bureaucrats, have grown by 81%. Management directives, 75%. Now we have countering weapons of mass destruction growing at 57%. You'd say, well, that sounds good. We should be countering weapons of mass destruction. But we had Secretary Mayorkas come in, and he testified that it wasn't a priority, and they really weren't involved with looking into the COVID leak. Well, I can think of no greater possible bioweapons threat than the release from a lab of a coronavirus that killed 15 million people worldwide. To have no investigation, to say we have a 57% increase in the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office, but had no involvement, and they claim to really know nothing about the COVID leak and not to have entertained it or done any research, you got to wonder where the money's going. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, grew 51%. With the growth of CISA, we've also had the accusations of First Amendment problems, and we have the accusations that basically CISA has been involved with going to social media companies and discussing language that is protected by the Constitution and asking social media companies to take down language protected by the Constitution. A lot of the bills we have before us will expand CISA. Shouldn't we be talking about whether or not there are adequate protections of the First Amendment and that the government's not involved with censoring our speech before we expand the powers of these agencies? We say we want to fund the border. We say we want to give our border agents a raise, but instead of taking our border seriously, we're giving blank checks to the DHS. And this last year, DHS has spent $123 million on electric vehicles that DHS told GAO they can't even use. $1.3 million on cybersecurity diversity fellowship, whatever that is. 75-day psychological safety workshop to ensure individuals show up as their authentic selves. I think that most of Congress should have to sit to the 75-day conference to see if we are our authentic selves when we show up for work. $160 million on projects to advance environmental justice, whatever that is, at FEMA. I guess these are the roads that are somehow bigoted and biased. $4.3 million on grants to house illegal immigrants. $17 million in unused hotel rooms. So $4.3 million spent to house immigrants, and then $17 million wasted on hotel rooms that were never used to house immigrants. $225,000 in a marketing campaign to convince migrants from Latin America not to come to the southern border. I'm sure that's working well. And these blatant examples of government waste aren't offensive enough. And by the way, we've had no hearings on any of this and no discussion of where we might save money. So if you want to expand money, we should tell the American people where we're going to save money so we don't always just add money. Everything we're doing today and everything we do in this committee is just to add more money. If these blatant examples of government waste aren't offensive enough, I want to show you how busy CISA has been creating graphic novels. I know you didn't realize this, but the Department of Homeland Security is making graphic novels. You can also see the videos. They're quite entertaining. In fact, in one of them, they have people skeptical of the vaccine actually physically assaulting a utility worker, taking them to the ground, pummeling them, and putting them in the hospital. Well, one, I've never seen any evidence of the news of this, of people who have skepticism towards the vaccine attacking utility workers, but this is what we're spending our money on, graphic novels. We have some of the examples of what it looks like here, the graphic novels, people saying things, and we need to take this down. If you want to counter bad knowledge, you should have more knowledge. It's always been what the First Amendment is about. The First Amendment is if someone says something despicable, in America, we don't censor speech. We counter despicable speech or wrong speech, or people have wrong ideas with more speech. If the government wants to put out information saying that, some ideas are not valid ideas, government should put it out. But taking down people's ideas is not something the government should be involved with. So of these 13 bills, some of them have good ideas, some of them don't, but they all cost more money. I don't think we've adequately brought in anybody. I don't think anybody from CISA's come in here to testify about how great a job they're doing, so we can ask them whether it's a good idea for CISA to be meeting with Twitter and saying, hey, we want you guys to take this stuff down. It's consistent with your policy. And Twitter's saying, well, we'll do it, but it's a lot of work. Will you pay us? And that's what's happening. Our government is paying Twitter to take down information, or at least they were doing that until Elon Musk took over. These are big issues. The First Amendment used to be a big issue for both parties. Democrats used to be the greatest of defenders of the First Amendment. And now things are topsy-turvy, and there doesn't seem to be interest in the majority party in protecting speech. We've gotten to this point where people think the speech is okay if I agree with it or if I think it's right. But if I think it's wrong, if I think it's anti-scientific, by golly, it should be taken down. Well, science is always being debated and disputed. Anthony Fauci, in committee, told me directly that he wasn't funding gain-of-function research in China. We now have evidence. We have the grant numbers from the NIH that he funded it. And you say, well, he says it's not gain-of-function. We now have an email that came out last week where he says in the email, summarizing a conversation from February 1st, 2020, where Anthony Fauci says, we're suspicious of a lab leak. He says at that time, a week later, he's saying it's crackpot theory. He says we're suspicious of a lab leak because we know they're doing gain-of-function research, and he describes the research. The research he describes is actually the research that he funded. So something's going on here, and there ought to be investigations of all of this, and we should use the committee to try to get into this. 1 million Americans died, and we really haven't thoroughly looked at, could this have come from a lab? If it came from the lab, what are we going to do to try to prevent this from happening? We're 3 years in, and there hadn't been a valid or significant discussion of what are we going to do. So I would say rather than passing dozens of bills we don't have time, perhaps we ought to spend some time trying to figure out what we can do to prevent 1 million Americans from dying with the next lab leak.